Did you know there's an island sitting in the middle of Chicago and that almost nobody who lives here can tell you it's there? 160 acres of land, wrapped on every side by water, barely 2 miles from the loop. You've probably been on it. If you've ever driven Halsted north of downtown or crossed the river on Division or North Avenue, you set foot on it and never knew. It even has a name people say all the time and almost never connect to a real place: Goose Island. Here's what makes it strange. It isn't natural. It didn't exist when Chicago was founded. A man dug it out of the river by accident, chasing money. And the moment it existed, the city did the thing Chicago has always done. With ground that nobody wanted, it filled the island with the people nobody wanted either. Picture one of them. It's winter, sometime in the 1850s, and you're standing inside a shanty 7 feet wide and 9 feet long, thrown together out of scrap lumber and tar paper on a mud flat in the middle of the Chicago River. There's one rickety bed the whole family shares. Outside, your geese are picking at the ice along the channel, and across the black water, the sky glows orange, not from any sunrise, but from the gas works burning off through the night. The neighbors call this place Little Hell. You crossed an ocean to stand in this mud, and you crossed it because a man you had never met, who owned the field your family had worked for 3 generations, decided you were cheaper to ship away than to keep alive. This is the story Chicago doesn't print on the beer label. In the late 1840s, the potato crop failed across Ireland, and roughly 1 million people starved to death. More than 1 million more fled. But some of them did not simply leave, they were sent. All over the country, landlords looked at estates packed with tenants who could not pay rent, and whom, under the poor law, those same landlords were now taxed to keep from starving. A number of them did the arithmetic and reached one cold conclusion: it was cheaper to empty the land than to feed the people on it. So they paid for one-way passage to America. The historian Perry Dewey traced one such group all the way to Chicago. They were tenants evicted in County Cork and County Mayo, whose own landlords bought their tickets out. Less an act of mercy than of accounting. They crossed in the holds of cargo ships refitted for human freight, the kind people learned to call coffin ships. And plenty of the people who boarded never got off the far end. The ones who survived landed in an American port with no money, no trade the country wanted, and no claim on anyone. In a Chicago that was booming, but had set aside exactly nothing for the destitute, they went hunting for the only thing they could afford, land nobody else wanted. As it happened, Chicago had just manufactured some. A few years earlier, the city's first mayor, William B. Ogden, by then out of office and one of the richest men in town, had spotted a thick seam of yellow clay in the marshes along the river's north branch. Clay makes brick, and a booming city devours brick. So, in 1853, Ogden formed a company, bought the land, and started digging it out. To float the clay away by water, his crews cut a channel from Chicago Avenue running north, and by 1857 that channel curved back into the river and sliced a piece of the mainland off completely. Ogden never set out to build an island. He set out to sell clay. The island was the leftover, 160 acres of dug-over, low-lying mud that flooded every spring and stank every summer, worth close to nothing to anybody who had a better option, which is precisely why it filled up with the people who didn't. The Irish moved onto the mud and built their shanties on land they held no title to, and for years nobody bothered to run them off, because what was it worth? They named the settlement Kilgubbin, after the very townland in County Cork they'd been driven out of, carrying the name of one lost home to the next. They raised pigs and chickens in the muck, and they kept flocks of geese in the river channels. And it was those geese paddling and hissing at anyone who came near that finally gave the place the name that stuck: Goose Island. The women raised the children and the livestock, and when the constables came, the old accounts say, they met them in the doorways with broomsticks. By the 1860s, Kilgubbin was the largest squatter settlement in Chicago. A few thousand people the respectable city pointed at to feel better about itself, a place the newspapers wrote about with a held nose and the police entered in numbers or not at all. But here's the thing those newspapers never wrote. For people who had been thrown off land, their families farmed for generations, shipped across an ocean like spoiled freight, and dumped in a strange city with nothing, this miserable, flooding, stinking mudflat, was the first ground in the world that no landlord could put them off of. They held no deed to it. But nobody else wanted it, and that, for once, made it theirs. For 30 years they built a life on that mud and raised a generation of children who would never see Ireland. It was the one place Chicago let them keep. For a while, that arrangement suited everyone with any power. The poor had somewhere to be, the somewhere was worthless, and the city got to look away. Then Chicago kept growing, and the arithmetic flipped, because it turned out Ogden's accidental island was perfect, not for people, but for industry. Water on every side for shipping and for dumping, rail lines running right up to it, and land still cheap, precisely because of who was living on it. So the factories came for the mud. Tanneries soaking hides in acid, soapworks boiling down fat, breweries, coal yards, lumber yards, and the towering wooden grain elevators that made Chicago the place the whole prairie came to sell its wheat. The People's Gas Works planted itself at the island's edge and burned through every night. Those were the flames that named Little Hell, and over the decades it left the ground soaked with coal tar and sludge that is still down there in the soil today. When fire tore through the American Varnish Works in 1896, even the New York Times bothered to notice and summed the place up in 3 words: a dilapidated locality. And here is the cruelty folded inside the whole thing. The people of Kilgubbin were the ones who worked those tanneries and yards. They cured the hides, hauled the coal, loaded the grain. They built the value of that land with their own hands and their own lungs. And the more valuable they made it, the less welcome they became on it, because the squatters had never owned a single square inch. So as the mud turned to money, the men who held the paper came to collect. Not in one dramatic raid, not with a single villain to blame. It was slower and more complete than that. Landowners filed forcible entry suits by the dozen. Juries ordered the squatters off. Police arrived in force to pull the shanties down, one court order at a time, one factory at a time, until Kilgubbin had simply dissolved and been paved over. The Irish scattered into other neighborhoods. The geese were driven off the channels, and the name stayed behind on the only thing that outlived the people, the land itself, now zoned for nothing but work. Here's the part that should bother you. Chicago would run this exact play again. A century later, barely a mile from Goose Island, on the same poor stretch of the near north side, the city built high-rise public housing for the people it still had nowhere else to put, Cabrini Green. And then, in our own time, when that land too became valuable, it tore the towers down and moved the residents out. The same instinct poured into newer concrete. Build a place for the people you don't want, on the ground nobody else wants, and reclaim the ground the moment it's worth something. Chicago has been running that play since the day it dug Goose Island out of the river. And the island itself? The tanneries are gone, the grain elevators are gone, the gas works is gone, Kilgubbin is gone, and the geese are long gone. The biggest tenant now is the global headquarters of a candy company, and the most famous thing ever to carry the island's name doesn't even sit on it. Goose Island Beer Company borrowed the name for a label in 1988, and in 2011 sold itself to the largest brewing corporation on Earth, run out of Belgium. So the name of a slum that Chicago built for its cast-offs is now a beer poured for tourists, owned an ocean away. And at the southern tip, where the poorest people in the city once squatted on ground worth nothing, a developer is raising 5 glass towers, roughly 2,600 apartments, and a hotel, a project called Halstead Point. The first people in the island's history who will live there because they chose to and because they can afford to. They'll have river views on every side, and almost none of them will ever know they're standing on an island at all, let alone whose island it was, or what it cost the people who were here first to turn this worthless mud into something worth living on, right up until the moment it was worth too much for them to stay.